So, welcome everyone to Isaac.health's webinar. We're so glad you could join us for today's session, for those with us currently live and also to those listening after for the recording. We're joining today's session to commemorate World Alzheimer's Day, which was recognised this past weekend. So Alzheimer's disease and related dementias impact millions of people all around the world, and it's really crucial that we come together to raise awareness, we share some knowledge and also support one another in advancing dementia care and brain health in general. So, hi, I'm Melissa Clark. I'm Head of Clinical Operations here at Isaac Health, and I'm going to be your moderator for tonight. And we're also truly fortunate to have an exceptional speaker leading today's conversation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joelle Salinas, co-founder and Chief Medical Officer of Isaac Health. So Dr. Salinas is a Harvard-trained neurologist, scientist, and a recognized leader in the field of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. But prior to Isaac Health, he served as the Assistant Professor of Neurology and the Clinical Director of the McCants Center for Brain Health at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He's a renowned leader in brain health and in memory care, and I'm absolutely stoked to be working alongside you. And we're thrilled to have him here tonight to talk about how socialization can actually impact brain health. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. I want to remind you briefly that you can actually leave some questions for a Q&A. We'll have some questions and answer time at the end of the session today. So to do so, you just navigate to the bottom bar in this Zoom meeting. Click on the Q&A box and you can type in your questions there. Feel free to ask as many as you like. There's no restrictions or quotas there. So without further ado, let's hand it over to Dr. Salinas.
Thank you, Melissa. So I'm really thrilled to be here. So on the topic of socialization and how it relates to brain health. And so I always like to start the conversation out with kind of just zooming out on just kind of what cognitive aging is. So from the moment we're born, our brain is developing. We have all sorts of brain cell connections being made. And then also there are some changes happening with the insulation of those brain cell connections that helps the brain to work faster and faster. That as we get older, usually after age 20, we start to have some changes where we start to have a steady decline. That decline is usually pretty mild, not to the level of causing any impairments. It can be noticeable for some people. There are also some cognitive areas that continue to improve. One of those is actual vocabulary, another is perspective taking, or what some people might call wisdom. But eventually, usually after age 80, you start to see those things decline as well. And so the physical brain, kind of as it might look when we were kind of younger, starts to change. And one of the things that we can see with the change is the buildup of these amyloid plaques that naturally occurs, but they can become abnormal, misfold, clump together. And it's believed that that sticky kind of clumping of those proteins together in combination with other proteins that might misfold or kind of build up like tau or the inflammation that might be happening around there is causing injury to the surrounding brain cells. And over time, what that looks like is the combination of the plaques and tangles that we usually associate with Alzheimer's disease, and we see some thinning or atrophy of the brain. But if you kind of really zoom out even further, there's so many different risk factors that occur across our lifespan that kind of influence the likelihood that these changes may happen. Oftentimes, when we think about research, we are thinking about kind of brain disease and mortality later on and the risk factors that happen just before that. So if we think about kind of like a river, we're kind of very far downstream. We're thinking about things like diabetes, high blood pressure, inflammation, obesity, small vessel degeneration. But if we think about the risks of risk, that brings us midstream, where we're thinking about things like issues with diet, chronic stress, gluten exposure, low physical activity, and smoking. And then we think about risks, then we really go far upstream, really kind of the root of the issue. These are called social determinants of health. They're also known as health-related social needs. They're related to each other. But you can see how long that list of social determinants is. And these are factors that relate to all these other factors that happen downstream. And one of the ones that is part of that upstream process is social relationships. One of the things that really inspired me to really do research in this area, because I've been doing quite a bit of research specifically related to these factors in my academic work, has been seeing all the different risk factors and protective factors that people can have throughout their life. And one of the things that we see is that later on, there's this rich social network element that happens. And I was just curious, why is it that our social relationships can impact our brain health either positively or negatively? Now, just to set some definitions, social relationships exist when two or more people influence each other's thoughts, feelings, and or behaviors. So it's kind of a general definition. But if we break that down even further into smaller definitions or smaller components, I like to think about it in terms of structure, function, and self-perception related to social relationships. So the first piece is the structure of social relationships. So that could be social networks. So social networks, that relates to kind of basic components of like the ego, the self, alters the people in your network, ties are the connections that you have with them. And if you have many of them, that's kind of the number of ties, the number of social contacts. If your contacts are tied to each other, let's say your friends are friends with each other, that starts to lead to what's called density within the social network. The other factor is social support. That's kind of the function of social relationships, and I've studied this as well. So there's the instrumental financial support, which is more kind of practical, helping you with chores, helping you with money issues. Informational is kind of giving you advice. Appraisal and companionship has to do with having somebody available there when you need it. And then emotional support is when you're in distress, having somebody who can help you with the emotional difficulties that are going on. And then there's loneliness, which is important to note because it's different from the term social isolation. The social isolation really has to do when you don't really have many social contacts and you're not coming into contact with those social ties. Whereas loneliness has to do with the perception that you're not really receiving kind of the amount of social support as you would prefer to have or you'd like to have. So it's kind of like a perceived social isolation. In particular, it's the distress that you experience when the expectation really isn't being met. There's been a lot of research in this area over the last several years, especially with the pandemic. And what we see is that generally social relationships do have an impact on our brain health kind of generally. So we've seen results looking at social networks and social support showing how they seem to link to an increase in risk of having strokes. We've also seen in social networks that seem to have an increase in or be tied to risk of developing dementia. And social support seems to be linked to kind of cognitive functioning, memory and thinking functions of the brain. Here's an example of one study. This is coming from the health and retirement study. This is looking at 16,000 people over the course of several years. And what they did is they looked at people in terms of kind of how connected they were with their social environment, volunteering, part of groups, how many people they said that were in their close network. And they followed them over time based off of whether they had high social integration or high kind of social kind of network involvement and participation versus low. And what they saw is that over time, memory scores had a different pattern between those two, where people who had high social integration actually had a slower decline in memory scores compared to those that had low social integration. So it was almost kind of like a protection going on there. So this is something I've studied in the Framingham Heart Study. So this is a study, the Framingham Heart Studies has been following people since 1948 from Framingham, Massachusetts, following generation across generation. And one of the things that we looked at there is we looked at over 2,000 people specifically to see what was the impact of loneliness early in their life, and then 10 years later on the risk of developing dementia. And so when we looked at people overall, kind of in an older category of individual without any other kind of specific differentiation there, what we saw is that those that were lonely seemed to have a slight increase in the rate of developing dementia over the course of 10 years. And I think that kind of is lined up pretty well with what we see in other studies. But what was especially interesting is that when we broke this down into groups of people who were less than age 80, who did not have common genetic risk factors, so common age factors related to dementia and common genetic risk factors, this is specific as ApoE4, so people that did not have an ApoE4, which is a genetic risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease specifically, what we saw is that those individuals had almost a threefold increase in risk of developing dementia over the course of 10 years. And so what that might imply is that when somebody does not have typical risk factors, these social factors may actually play a heavier role in determining somebody's risk. There are other studies that have looked at many biological factors related to loneliness and social isolation. This is just a sampling of what that looks like. So for people who are experiencing social isolation and loneliness, we can see that they have increases in systemic inflammation. They have areas of the brain that seem to be smaller or more atrophied. There seems to be an impaired neural repair and kind of brain cell connection formation. There seem to be higher rates of anxiety and depression. Blood vessel health can be impaired as well. Sleep quality could also be impaired. Memory and thinking function can be impaired. And then there seems to be an increase in the rate of the buildup of kind of these neuritic plaques and tangles related to Alzheimer's disease. So it's a lot of things that are tied to it. And it can get even more refined in terms of how we think about social relationships and our social networks. So the types of support that people can kind of receive, or the reason why someone may have a higher or lower risk, can relate to things like, your access to resources and goods related to your social network. It can be related to social support, whether you're getting kind of emotional support or kind of help with kind of day-to-day things. It can relate to person-to-person contact. So, for example, being at risk for more infectious diseases. That was something that was also pretty relevant during the pandemic. Social engagement or kind of mental stimulation that can happen, and then other social influences. So, for example, if the behaviors of your peers, for example, are influencing your own. So let's say you like to hang around people who are really into eating lots of muffins and drinking beer. Maybe you're more likely to eat lots of muffins and drink beer, and that would increase your risk for things like diabetes and high blood pressure and thus also dementia. I looked a little bit more closely at this with the Framing Heart study. This was a study trying to really understand something called cognitive resilience, which has to do with a buffer effect that happens in the brain. So regardless of what changes may be going on in the brain, your functioning will remain about the same kind of in spite of that. And what we saw in this study is that looking at the scans again over 2,000 people, was that those people who specifically said that they had higher rates of listener availability, meaning that they had somebody available to listen to them when they needed it. So those that were in the higher listener availability, where they had somebody most or all the time available, it seemed to have a little bit more of a resistance to the effects of brain aging compared to those that had lower listener availability. And so that might relate to this kind of resilience or kind of reserve kind of factor that we talk about. Now, just going beyond just the science, like what can I do very practically to take care of my brain? Well, just very simply, as we age, feeling connected and having purpose is a really key part of brain health, and part of that it relates to kind of our social connections and our communities. And being social can look at all very differently in many different contexts. You could join a group, you could get a pet, you can teach somebody something new, you can volunteer to help others, you can use technology to help to keep you connected with others, especially if it's hard to be physically in contact with others. The technology helps. It might not be as good as being in person with somebody else, but at least it creates a little bit of that real-time kind of connection. And then just to simply, share a smile with people, and that will begin to kind of feed into that ability to be much more likely to develop kind of peers. One common thing that comes up in conversations about loneliness and social isolation is how challenging it can be to develop friends and peers later in life. And so what it seems to be is, when we are in school, right, when we're much younger, we have so much access to people in one place and we're more likely to develop friends. But over time, we tend to lose our friends. And that has to do with things like we kind of start our families, we become much more insular, we have work responsibilities that kind of really tie us up. We move away from each other, some of us get sick and some of us pass away. And so one of the things that we often will recommend is kind of almost treat your social relationships almost like an investment portfolio, where you want to preserve your social relationships as much as possible, because it is harder to build new ones over time. You also want to diversify that social relationship portfolio, where you want to have people who are there for good humor, for emotional support, people who can help you with chores. Really mix that up so that way, even if you did lose a social connection in one area, you have other people around you who can continue to fill kind of that social support need that you might have. And we all can always give advice on how to start to create new friendships and new ties. That often comes with shared interests. So engaging in groups where you have a shared interest can be really, really helpful. And then there's another piece that has to do with just managing the awkwardness of meeting new people. It can be really hard. And so sometimes it can be helpful to work with a psychotherapist or a talk therapist to kind of manage some of that anxiety, kind of discomfort around kind of taking that social risk of meeting new people. And specifically, there's something called cognitive behavioral therapy that can teach you some really practical strategies around that. In Isaac, what we do to really support people's brain health really involves kind of looking at not just kind of the physical body, but also kind of one's mental health as well as their social health. And so that includes, we come to you and we help you out with care, but we're also trying to address what are the issues that are occurring with you in terms of like isolation, or you're having a hard time leaving your home because of the steps that you have, for example, and you have some physical limitations, or do you need help with kind of plugging you into some resources? We help with that as well. And this is also true for care partners or caregivers, people who provide support for somebody who has a cognitive issue like dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. They also have a tendency to become isolated. The well-known actor Bradley Cooper, he was a caregiver for his father, who had cancer, and he kind of had this experience of feeling very isolated and lonely. And he kind of related how, even though he's coming from a position of privilege, right? He's a well-known actor, he has a lot of resources. He still felt very lonely and isolated, and for him, he just was really shocked and couldn't imagine what people who didn't have the resources he had might be going through. And so he started a foundation around this. But aside that, this is kind of built into our DNA. We're asking about feelings of loneliness and social support all throughout. And so we'll work with you to help to figure out how you can best kind of get more connected and more engaged with your social environment. And that might include kind of referrals to local resources, or finding local communities or online communities. And just to kind of give a little bit of perspective, um, social well-being is really important. It's built into the definition of health in the World Health Organization, which is defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. I also have been really lucky to be involved in the American Academy of Neurology's definition of what brain health means. And that definition includes the continuous state of attaining and maintaining one's optimal neurologic functioning to best support your physical, mental, and social well-being as well. So social ends up being a really important part here. So just to summarize kind of what we've talked about in this kind of mini chalk talk here is, one is that social relationships are essential for brain health, especially when social isolation and loneliness are prevented. Companionship and supportive listening is associated with better cognitive outcomes, and there's a lot that you can do right now to improve your brain health. So we're always happy to help anybody who has any questions or is interested in working with our team. You can always find us on our website at myisaac.health.com, or you can give us a call at 888-818-2059. But with that said, I would love to, I'm going to stop the sharing here and open it up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, so a reminder, everyone, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen at the moment. So if you click on the Q&A, it's got a question mark is there as well. And you can type in your question. More than one is fine. You can type in one question at a time. And then we'll push those over to Dr. Salinas. So we do have one to get us started. So someone from the audience has said, I have read that women as a group have greater incidence of Alzheimer's than men. Does loneliness impact women more, or are they more subject to loneliness? What a great question.
Great question. You're right. So when it comes to health disparity, we think about who might be at higher risk of developing conditions like Alzheimer's disease. We do see that there are racial and ethnic differences. So people who are Black Americans, they are twice as likely to develop these conditions. Hispanic Americans are 1.5 times more likely, and then women are also more likely. And so in terms of why that is, there's still a lot of research to understand that some of that might be related to biological differences, but there hasn't been as much science to really support that as much, but it's still an active area of research. But it may be related to these psychosocial factors. And loneliness and social isolation may be a contributor here. It's hard to know exactly how, but I actually looked at this question using an epidemiologic cohort called the Women's Health Initiative, which is one of the largest kind of cohorts of people in the US who are followed after menopause. And what we looked at in that specific question was people who are at risk of developing post-stroke depression. So after somebody's experienced a stroke, do they develop depression? A different question from Alzheimer's disease, but it does relate to brain health generally. And one of the findings that really surprised me was that people who had a high degree of social connections before their stroke actually were at an increased risk of developing depression after stroke. And so it's not as clear cut, whether more or less social connections are better for you. And part of that is, and this is kind of what I looked into a little bit further, which is that it's not just about the number or the quantity, it's about also the quality of those connections. So there's been some work showing that And this is kind of true of kind of traditional roles that women within the like Western cultures are kind of put in as more of a supportive role. And it's also true of other cultures. But when you have many ties, but you're the one that's providing the support for all those ties, you're much more likely to be at risk for stress, anxiety, depression, and all these things that might increase your risk of dementia. And what we really want is not just more ties, but ties that actually support you, or should at least be bi-directional. So I really appreciate that question. Thank you for asking it.
Brilliant. Thanks for the answer. I do have another question here. So, how significant is the impact of social isolation on dementia risk compared to other risk factors like genetics or lifestyle choices?
Ah, great. So the Lancet is a medical journal that publishes out a kind of a review of risk factors that relate to dementia. They've been doing that every 4 years, I believe now, and they just published one kind of fairly recently. And in this kind of like mid to late life stage, it is a considerable proportion. It's about 8 to 10%, I believe, across kind of 14 other factors. But it is one that is significant. You know, there are some studies that show that kind of risks related to things like loneliness can actually be equated to risks of being a smoker. So being lonely can kind of increase your risk of conditions similar to being exposed to other really unhealthy kind of things that increase your risk. So I would say it is a fairly important thing. And it's not one of these things where, you know, you're lonely and that's it. There was this one study out of the Framingham Heart study that looked at something called kind of persistent versus kind of transient loneliness. So basically, following people over the course of many years, they developed loneliness, and they were followed again, and then they asked the same question: Are you experiencing loneliness still? People who experienced loneliness once, but then no longer after a couple of years, actually had no change in their risk. Whereas
Mm,
people who had loneliness and continued to have loneliness were at an increase in risk. And it gets much more complicated because there are some studies that suggest that loneliness leads to an increase in the risk of developing dementia due to issues with kind of like stress and hormones and kind of your blood vessel health, etc. But there's also some research that might support that underlying changes going on in the brain already due to Alzheimer's disease may impair not just like social cognition, but also may manifest itself with feelings of loneliness.
mm,
So I think it's likely to be a bi-directional thing where it's both it increases your risk and could be a manifestation of disease as well. But it seems to be a pretty crucial role. And there's ongoing research going on for the right now to really better understand kind of not just how social isolation and loneliness impact risk, but also how can we intervene on that risk.
yeah. Wow. So informative. Thank you. Another question. Are there specific types of social interactions that have actually been shown to be more beneficial for brain health than others?
Mm. Yeah, so when we look at social networks, there's been some work showing how certain behavioral risk factors can flow through the network, almost like a contagion. So that example is looking at smoking status and obesity. It does seem that your social connections, regardless of how physically close to you they are, and in terms of like your neighborhood or your city, seems to have an impact. So if your friend's friend's friend is obese or a smoker, you're more likely to be obese or a smoker. It's also true with a factor like happiness, where if people are kind of more happy in your network, you're more likely to be happy. This is actually work that I'm involved with right now that we're trying to really get to this question. So stay tuned for that. In terms of kind of the types of relationships that people have, this was kind of one of the reasons why we looked at um, the different types of social support. And what we saw is that things like emotional support seem to be helpful in kind of reducing risk of dementia and stroke. But this listener availability, for some reason, had kind of a very unique impact in terms of building kind of resilience or reserve. So I think that there is an element of kind of this that not only that you have more social connections, but those connections support you in return that really has a bigger influence on your brain health.
Mhm. Wow. Talk about quality over quantity, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, another question. Can video calls or social media offer the same brain health benefits as in-person interactions?
Oh, yeah, love the question. So this is something that um, is still being understood in the research. Um, but what we know, at least from some kind of preliminary types of research or exploratory research, is that I'll give you the example of one specifically looking at um, oxytocin levels in the body. So people talk about oxytocin as like the hugging hormone or the cuddle hormone, but basically it's a social related kind of brain hormone. And they looked at levels of this hormone in daughters and mothers in three different situations where the daughters across all three groups were going off to college. And so there's some separation there. And what they looked at was mothers and daughters who communicated just via text, mothers and daughters who communicated just over phone, and mothers and daughters who communicated in person. And what they saw was that whether or not somebody connected via phone or in person, there was no difference in the oxytocin levels between those two groups, but there was clearly a difference between those that communicated via text and those that had the phone or in-person piece. So I would say that there's almost a kind of like hierarchy of social benefit that comes with the more real time, the more stimulating, the more your senses are engaged, that social activity is. But I would still say that it's better to have some social connection rather than none. So if your only way to kind of connect with others is kind of online in communities or via text message, I think that's better than nothing. The next step up would be over a phone, and the next step over that would be video, kind of like what we're doing right now, because it's real time and it's engaging, and we've got more senses involved. And the next step, the best step, ultimately being the in-person kind of connection.
And I guess when you're texting someone, it can be very one way. It's asynchronous. It's not necessarily at the same time, and so that
Exactly.
listener availability as part of your study is lowered. It feels like.
Right.
Yeah, cool. How does the frequency of socialization affect brain health? So, for example, weekly versus monthly social interactions.
Mm.
Is there an ideal amount that we should all be aiming for?
Yeah, I don't think we know enough to be able to like write a prescription for it, but from the research that has been done, essentially we would be looking at being in contact at least twice per month with somebody who you're close with. Um, but the actual frequency of that contact doesn't matter as much as um, kind of the perception of that support or the availability of that support. So that's why I think the listener availability question is unique because it's not about how often is somebody listening to you so much as how often do you have access to somebody available when you need it, like mostly all the time. There was actually one study out of the Harvard Men's Health Study looking at mortality, and the one factor that seemed to be most impactful was not kind of like heart disease or kind of cholesterol levels or blood pressure. It was whether or not they could answer in the affirmative um, in the middle. If you have somebody in your social network who in the middle of the night in a crisis you could call. So
Okay.
having the availability of somebody that could help you in a crisis seemed to predict kind of whether or not somebody had a higher or lower risk of mortality. So there is something about kind of the general strength of those networks and the kind of support you're getting from those networks.
Yeah. Just made me think to myself, who would I call in an emergency? That's
Yeah.
nice. Yeah. Okay. And then I do have another final question here. So, what are some practical steps that I can take to increase my social engagement, especially later in life or during retirement, where, like you say, we don't have those forced social interactions? Any specific suggestions to help us out?
Yeah. I mean, I think one piece is to one preserve your existing connection. So that might mean kind of reconnecting with people that previously you were close with in your life. Those can be a little bit easier to to bring back. But another way is to kind of approach your interactions with people around you with kind of like a social connection, kind of like lean. It's almost like a connection hygiene, as I would call it, which is try to get to know strangers. Try to get to know people in your building. There are these people in our lives who are not close, kind of confidant, but they're acquaintances. And there's been some research looking at this that there is some power to these acquaintances. It's like the person who cuts your hair, the bank teller. It's the person who helps bag your groceries, the person at the register. the person who you happen to run into every once in a while in your hallway or outside your house. Um, Being able to kind of graduate that relationship from just casual acquaintance to friend can just be as simple as starting to have more of a conversation with them, asking them how they're doing, kind of being friendly with them. You can't really make friends without being friendly yourself, and so there's that element of kind of putting yourself out there. And I think the other kind of hack there is to engage in groups where people have similar interests. With similar interests, there's just so many activities that you can engage in together. There's something to talk about already. And so if you find like a group or a class, whether it's online or in person, that can be a great way. I always love to recommend that people take a dance class. Not because I necessarily want them to go to parties and show up for dancing, but it's got three kind of really important elements of brain health tied to it. One is the physical activity of the dancing. The second is the mental stimulation of learning the dance moves, and the third, and this kind of relates to kind of the topic today, is the socialization that comes from it. So classes or groups that you can kind of engage with, if you have similar interests, can make it a lot easier to connect with other people and really build those relationships up. And the more you're in connection with them, the more you kind of do this dance of kind of being vulnerable with them, and then kind of letting other people be vulnerable with you, and kind of showing that they can trust you to kind of hold that vulnerability, can also really help to make that a stronger connection.
I love that. Very practical. I think working remotely, at Isaac, we work remotely. And so doing that, I miss those connections as well. And so sometimes I'll actually just be vulnerable with complete strangers and just say, I'm actually trying to make new friends. Would you like to grab a coffee? Just being vulnerable and just putting yourself out there. It can be really uncomfortable at first, but when you actually put it out there, oftentimes those people are trying to make those same connections. You're not the only one. So
Right.
sometimes be vulnerable to get vulnerable. So yeah.
Yeah, and it can be a hit or miss, right?
Oh,
The
absolutely.
next person you meet doesn't mean that they're going to be your best friend, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Just like dating earlier in life. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's nice to have those familiar acquaintances. Yeah,
Right, right. But you're not going to find that kind of like close confidant if you don't take the risk.
exactly. Yeah. Take the leap.
Hmm.
Well, I don't have any more questions coming in, so I'll give everyone just a second, just in case you would like to ask any follow-up questions. Give them a second. Nothing coming through. Okay, so we'll close it out for this evening. So thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you join us this evening in this wonderful session commemorating World Alzheimer's Day, bringing awareness to Alzheimer's and dementia-related diseases. So we'll be reaching out after this session to see if you have any feedback or if you do have any other questions. But until then, have a wonderful evening and we hope to see you next time. Take
Thank you
care.
all.
Bye.
Bye bye.